This video is brought to you by Sleepherd, a game by Junferno currently in development. Check the description to follow the pre-launch page on Kickstarter and wishlist the game on Steam. Let's talk about my face.
And there are other entities like text. Say after there, I'd like to copy from that. Say after there, I'd like to copy from that. Say after there, I'd like to copy from that. So we've seen how we can start with a blank piece of paper and go there, I'd developing a file. Say after there, I'd like to copy a file.
This is an experimental office system. It's in use now at the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, California. Soon, Xerox systems like this will help you manage your most precious resource, information. Precious resource, information. Precious resource, information. Precious resource, information.
By the 1980s, the computer was no longer just for computing. The computer was a file system, and all of the files in it, the spreadsheets, the presentations, the diagrams, the sketchbooks. The computer was your typewriter. The computer was your calculator. The computer was your desktop. As the 80s turned into the 90s, it appeared as if the computer could be anything. And so Microsoft asked, what if a computer could be a gorilla? It is difficult to begin making a computer a gorilla. Gorillas have bananas. Computers have florp. Gorillas could be on computers though, and so we can start there. One example of a gorilla on a computer is BonziBuddy, who is also spyware and adware. Joe Bonzi and Jay Bonzi of Bonzi Software made BonziBuddy using Microsoft Agent, the more popular one. Microsoft Agent is the code behind the cultural failure of Office Assistant, first released for Microsoft Office 97 on Windows. The concept behind Office Assistant is Microsoft's assumption that Windows users wouldn't be able to figure out Microsoft Office without the help of Albert Einstein. Office Assistant broke free from the traditional desktop metaphor of the computer by adding to the desk a tutorial PNG tuber. Animated cartoon mascots such as Clippit and Brian Griffin popped up and offered tips on the usage and functionality of software such as Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Word. Additionally, if the assistant wasn't popping up enough, the user could ask it questions directly via text. As any millennial on Facebook Messenger or Threads will tell you, Office Assistant was known for popping up way too often, getting in the way, and giving useless and repetitive information. It was turned off by default on Office XP and then removed altogether after Office 2003. Remembered by College Humor and The Office as an annoying but silly and weird thing that Microsoft made. Today, relegated to a level 1 edutainment topic, down there with Bogosort and etymology, but perhaps due to its lighthearted, naive, simplistic genuineness. In contrast to the many villainous deeds, the Clippit mascot of Office Assistant has become somewhat of the Big Chungus of the consumer rights movement on YouTube, with slogans along the line of "Clippy just wanted to help."
Within the Microsoft Office products, one of the things that we understand is that users are frequently challenged in terms of the way they need to support themselves on a day-to-day basis. They need an easier way to get the help that they want, and an easier way to get help on things only when they need it. Well, this user interface, the user assistance in the product, manifests itself in the form of something we call the Office Assistant. I'm going to call the Office Assistant up here, and you'll see now when the user encounters a problem.
How does one prove the existence of God? This is a question that matters not just to computer scientists, but also to theologians. According to Office Assistant, the answer is that you can copy a slide from one presentation to another. The Reverend Richard Price had a similar idea in 1763, that because the world is governed by the orderly laws of cause and effect, a proportionally intelligent cause must have been there for the effect of the entire world. Price wrote this in a letter prefacing an essay published on behalf of his recently deceased friend. The Reverend and statistician Thomas Bayes. Bayes' theorem, as it is known today, was developed by Laplace, but it was initially discovered by Bayes in the essay published by Price, just that it was missing an important step, and also no one noticed it or cared. And it is the revolutionary algebraic idea that things are caused by other things. Not only that though, but that one can find the probability of a cause given an effect. Let's say you have two related events. The probability that both of them happen is equal to the probability that the first one happens, multiplied by the probability that the second one happens if the first one happens. We can see the same thing if we switch the events around. If you combine these two equations, what you get is that the probability that A happens if B happens is equal to the probability that B happens if A happens, multiplied by the probability that A happens divided by the probability that B happens. And so, what Laplace's Bayes' theorem is saying is that if we have the probabilities of two events, A and B, on their own, then we can flip the likelihood of B if A is true into the likelihood of A if B is true. Before we get to the part about the gorillas though, what is the probability of anything? This is a question that can be answered in many ways. A frequentist may say that probability is ideally objective, like the frequency of something happening if you tried it an infinite number of times. This is the interpretation that most statisticians use, probably. But does uncertainty exist outside of the mind? A Bayesian would say that probability is belief. But what is belief, and what is a space shuttle? To answer the second question, a space shuttle is something that looks like this, with engines that look like this, and there are crewmates inside of it, and one of the crewmates is an imposter. In 1992, the VISTA project was a collaborative research effort in developing time-critical decision-making software for diagnosing and responding to faults such as engine failure at NASA Mission Control. Propulsion systems of the space shuttles were equipped with sensors for temperature and pressure in various critical locations. However, abnormal readings from the sensors could mean one of many faults. In an emergency situation, the decision to be made ultimately depended on what ground control believed. The VISTA team, including a propulsion specialist from NASA, created what they called the Belief Network. With the help of the specialist, the network took the physical connections between components within the engine and mapped them to connections representing causes with probabilities between different events. For example, a helium tank leak should cause a change in the helium pressure, which would show up in two helium pressure readings, but those readings could also just be errors in the helium pressure sensors. And so we should see if that helium pressure change also affected the oxygen tank pressure reading, but that reading could also be affected by an oxygen tank leak, or a fault in the helium-oxygen valve, and so on and so forth. The key to this network is Bayes' theorem. By being able to flip these probabilistic causalities propagated through the network, we can estimate the probabilities of causes as new information from the sensors is obtained, thereby establishing a priority to bring to the attention of ground control. What Pierre-Simon Laplace was able to achieve that Thomas Bayes couldn't was to use Bayes' theorem to begin the formulation of Bayesian probability, the changing of probability with knowledge and the quantification of personal belief. Bayesian probability had made a comeback many decades before NASA's Project VISTA, and the Belief Network was just one of many Bayesian inference models. VISTA went online at the Space Shuttle Mission Control Center in 1994, but by then one of the researchers, Eric Horvitz, was working at Microsoft. Imagine if instead of magic, wizards just answered questions about Microsoft Office 95. That is the vision of Microsoft in the Microsoft Office 95 Answer Wizard. The Answer Wizard was one of the results of Microsoft research since 1993 on the Lumiere project. Lumiere is French for no reason, and it was Microsoft's investment into Bayesian inference. Instead of a propulsion specialist, they got cognitive psychologists to put people into rooms and make them do something on Microsoft Excel. They then found a couple of Microsoft Excel experts, which in 1993 was probably equivalent to today finding people who use Canva. The expert would be contained in a different room away from the normal person. From there, they could monitor the person's screen and the inputs from their mouse and keyboard. However, they did not know the person's assigned goal on Excel, and they could only give advice by typing onto a second screen. The person on the other side was only told that that screen was an experimental help system. The results of that experiment resulted in Bayesian networks different from that used for the Vista project, on account of the subtle differences between Microsoft Excel and a space shuttle. A pause in activity could mean that a user needs help, but it could also mean that they're watching Gakuen babysitters. And so we should consider the user's expertise, the difficulty of the current task, and recent menu surfing. These pieces of evidence give us the probabilities to decide if the pause is caused by the user needing assistance or just being distracted. This is just one part of the bigger Bayesian network. Another Bayesian network is needed for inferring what assistance that user needs. For example, if a user repeatedly changes a chart, perhaps they deserve a visit from the chart wizard. Actions are also less relevant the longer ago they were, and so their influence on the probability decays as time passes or as more actions are incurred. Once the probability that the user needs help passes a certain threshold, Lumiere offers suggestions based off of the probabilities of what the user needs. This threshold is an adjustable value described as how much the user wants to be bothered. Lumiere was customizable, accommodating, and helpful, but it had one critical flaw, in that it went against Microsoft's design policy of not being any of those things. Microsoft executives incorporated the Bayesian methods for interpreting a question and for predicting user suggestions from Lumiere into Office Assistant for Microsoft Office 97. But the Bayesian network for predicting whether or not help was needed in the first place, together with the adjustable bother me threshold, was left out. As we all know, the good thing about philosophical theology and space exploration is that they eventually result in profitable consumer goods. So why would Microsoft use a simple system of if statements for determining when to bring out the assistant, rather than the intricate Bayesian model already developed by Lumiere? Wouldn't we want to only help Office users when we believe they actually wanted help? The Lumiere team with Eric Horvitz told Microsoft that they were concerned about this executive decision causing the assistant to be distracting. Perhaps it was to save memory, or perhaps Microsoft executives just thought that an algorithm good enough for NASA wasn't good enough for Microsoft Outlook. But surely Microsoft is a competent company, so what is missing from this story? Let's talk about my face. What face did you imagine when you were listening to my disembodied voice? And now that you've seen my face, how does that change your perception of this video? Perhaps a face makes a video feel more human. A face, after all, is one of the indicators of the presence of a human being. But the truth is that I am not a human. I am a YouTube video. The Juneferno that you're watching right now is not here. Juneferno is elsewhere, watching Gakuen babysitters. A face doesn't necessarily indicate a human. It indicates a social actor. Unlike computer science, going outside and talking to people follows a set of expected conventions and guidelines. These guidelines arise from an expectation of cooperation between yourself and the other social actor at the computer science party. I, for instance, always follow all of Grice's maxims. The reason why Microsoft overlooked the concerns of their researchers, the reason why Microsoft made Microsoft Bob, the reason why Microsoft ignored all the women in their focus groups, could all be traced back to a study at Stanford University in 1994. Actually, Microsoft probably would have done that third thing anyway. CASA is Spanish for house, but it also stands for computers are social actors. Having a face is a social cue, which means it indicates to a person that they are communicating with another person, thus making a social actor. But even something without a face could still have a voice, which is also a social cue. And even something without a voice could still have language, responsiveness, the ability to perform tasks. These most basic cues exist on the Domino's Pizza website, but more broadly, they exist on computers. So what if we tried observing if these social cues performed by computers elicited social behavior in response students. The experiments presented by the CASA paper each followed the same premise, in which the researchers, including Clifford Nass, took a social phenomenon and attempted to observe it in computers. The computers demonstrated a software for tutoring, followed by a test, and then an evaluation of the tutor based off of the test. A pool of computer-literate college students would go through the tutoring, take the test, see the evaluation, and then fill out a questionnaire on their attitudes on the entire process. Politeness is a social behavior alongside aversion to narcissism and misogyny that the paper describes as saying someone is better at something when asked by that person directly as opposed to asked by someone else behind that person's back. The implicit social reasoning here being that perhaps direct criticism can feel much more personal, and so is much less easy than indirect criticism through a third party. However, a computer does not have feelings and is not individual to other computers, and so there is no logical reason to soften or sweeten direct criticism towards it. The study showed conclusively that after going through the tutoring, testing, and evaluating on the same computer, the subject gave a significantly more favorable assessment of the computer's friendliness and competency on the final questionnaire if that questionnaire was conducted on the same computer that was used for the testing, tutoring, and evaluating, compared to if that questionnaire was conducted on a different computer running the same questionnaire software or with pen and paper. People know that computers cannot be arrogant, and yet when the evaluation phase praises the tutoring, it is assessed to be much more friendly and accurate when that praise is coming from a different computer compared to when it is coming from the same computer that did the tutoring. Additionally, criticism is assessed to be much less friendly but more intelligent when coming from a different computer. People don't actually believe that binary, non-binary computers hold personal gender identities, and yet, when the evaluation phase was given a male voice, subjects' assessments of the tutor were in significantly higher agreeance of the evaluator's praise, and the evaluator itself was assessed to be significantly more likable than when the evaluation phase was done in the same way but with a female voice. Each experiment was providing strong evidence that computer machines were being automatically conceived as social individuals, subject to the same social norms and prejudices of our society, of our patriarchy, and of our human world. Microsoft took this groundbreaking research and made the Homestuck of program managers. Clifford Nass, together with fellow professor of communication at Stanford Byron Reeves, were hired as consultants by Microsoft for a project led by the designers behind Microsoft Publisher. It was codenamed Utopia, but perhaps it would have been better codenamed Zootopia. In continuation of Publisher's graphic-centric information, designers Karen Fries and Barry Lynette prototyped a digital helper in the form of a duck. And after positive feedback from focus groups, including this guy who probably just needed a therapist, Utopia came to be. The consultation of Nass and Reeves brought a philosophy to Utopia. In the 90s, there was still a significant number of people who had difficulty learning how to use a computer. If we simply increased the number of social cues exhibited by a computer, took these unused social behaviors and brought them to the forefront of the interface, then maybe using a computer would be as natural as having a conversation. But because no one at Microsoft knows how to have conversations, they made it really stupid for no reason. Utopia was Microsoft Bob, the replacement for the desktop. Its creative design was meant to be the Apple killer, as well as everything that came before Apple, and after as well. Just kill everything, basically. Instead of a desktop, you are in a house of horrors. To navigate to any program, you must go through a Scooby-Doo point-and-click adventure. To access the clock, calendar, or checkbook, the user must click on the actual clock, calendar, or checkbook somewhere in the room. Hang out with a Bill Gates book while you track your credit card expenses. Or this dog while you read up on tips for divorce. And here is a guillotine for purely decorative purposes. Microsoft Bob released to underperforming sales in 1995 due to the average adult not not being an 8-year-old executioner. But the death of Bob was not the death of the idea of Bob, the idea to step ahead of the desktop metaphor that grew out of the 1970s into the Apple Macintosh, and be the first one aboard the social metaphor. The desktop metaphor embraced by Apple for its Macintosh computers made sense, because traditionally, a desktop is where we kept our files and our tools. But if a computer really was a social actor, then maybe we've got it all wrong. Maybe a computer is something between a desk and a human. Maybe computers were meant to interface with humans in a third new way. A way that's not quite companion, yet not quite device. Something with eyes and a voice. Something animal. Something neither man nor monkey. An animated sprite or an anthropomorphic alien. Not just doing what the user needs, but also smiling and eating bananas. What if a computer was a gorilla? If we assume that Microsoft wanted their computers to be a gorilla, then their decision-making begins to make sense. If the issue was predominantly memory, there are plenty of frivolous features in Microsoft Office that could be cut before a system as critical as knowing whether or not a user needed help before helping them. The reason for stunting Lumiere's decision-making, according to an Economist article in 2001 featuring Eric Horvitz, was that Lumiere as it was deemed by Microsoft to be too cautious. But how could it be too cautious when it comes with a slider that could set how cautious it is? Microsoft must have either believed that bothering their users wasn't such a big deal, or that the rate that the assistant should appear was far beyond the rate that we believed users wanted to see it. This checks out if the goal is to simply maximize social cues, to show the user as much as possible that the computer has a face, makes sounds, gives dialogue. It doesn't matter that it's distracting anymore because it's a gorilla, it's Family Guy, it's an anime character, and those are all your friends. Microsoft wasn't just monkeying around, Microsoft saw a future where computers were full of monkeys.
The border between the two isn't so clear.
The only problem with Microsoft is they just have no taste.
Blippy was based on a really tragic misunderstanding of a truly profound bit of scientific research. At Stanford University, the Clifford Nass and Byron...
and not, again, in the obvious ways of talking to the football play-by-play commentators or yelling at your computer, although those do happen.
At the core of Lumiere are Bayesian methods and models for reasoning under uncertainty that are used to determine the likely intentions, goals, and needs of the user.
You went and asked all these people, and you're just going to discard all of this information? We ended up shipping with 10 male characters and 2 female characters.
In 1996, after Microsoft Bob and before Microsoft Office Assistant, Nass and Reeves jointly published The Media Equation, in which the theories from CASA were extended towards other new media. They described conducting the politeness experiment again, but with no images, no voices, no icons, just black and white text and buttons. The result of that experiment was that politeness was observed from the subjects again, with no difference from when it was conducted another time with voices. The theory was never that more social cues caused more social behaviors, but rather that social behaviors were caused by the simplest of social cues. And when those social behaviors are triggered, the social actor is held to the standards of social etiquette. Standards such as giving the correct amount of information and making sure that information is relevant and clear. Microsoft was so ambitious to make their computers social actors that they killed what made the social actor acceptable, which was its politeness. All the while, the computer was already a social actor. Ironically, the design that would have upheld the research of Nass and Reeves was what Lumiere was originally, a simple interface that prioritized understanding the user's needs and minimizing the risk of bothering them. You can make computers gorillas, but there's no reason to do that. Unfortunately, the closer we get to modern computer science, the more I become a tech YouTuber. I am not a tech YouTuber. For instance, I would never contribute to the economy. But if there's one thing that definitely came out of the 1990s, it's the 2000s. What does Clippy just wanted to help mean? Clippy is not a person, and computer scientists should generally never use literary devices. A software is either helpful or unhelpful, for which Microsoft Office Assistant was decidedly unhelpful. A poet may say that Clippy just wanted to help has nothing to do with its actual helpfulness, rather that helpfulness as the intent was the sole business strategy of Microsoft Office Assistant, in contrast to modern anti-user tactics, that the negative reception of Clippy was disproportionate to what companies get away with now. But Clippy's failure was driven with purpose and ideology by a board that was presented with a study demonstrating the permeation of systemic misogyny in computer interactions, and went on to throw out any data suggesting against making the assistants predominantly male. These issues may seem micro and soft when stacked against the controversies that headlined the past decade, but if we were to consider placing Clippy on a pedestal, the narrow-sighted mismanagement and the use of psychological research to take advantage of issues affecting the socially disadvantaged are at least nowhere inconsistent or exceptional. Had Microsoft invasively collected user data in Office 97 like they do today, they would have gone the way of Bonzi software. Instead, Microsoft sought to monopolize, embracing open standards by developing compatible software, using their dominant market share to extend those standards with their own features, and then extinguishing the competition when the open standard became incompatible with Microsoft's new proprietary de facto standards that competitors could not support, gradually replacing an open ecosystem with Microsoft property, all of which was happening as early as 1994, setting the architecture for a monopoly that Microsoft Office is a part of, a monopoly that allows Microsoft to get away with the very practices criticized in the YouTube comments of branded Clippy promotional stunts. The internet has always had big chunguses of software just wanting to help. Linux, VLC, Blender, Wikipedia, many archives of our own. Clippy was not chosen at random, at least not subconsciously. It's different from Internet Explorer and Xbox Connect and the Zune. Clippy has nostalgic and aesthetic value. It remains in internet culture as a zeitgeist of an optimistic era, an amazing digital circus of a Microsoft disconnected from the Microsoft of today, when the free market flourished and computers just made paper clips. And unlike the others, Clippy has a face. He is voiced by the parrot from Aladdin. He makes TikToks and cameos in Copilot. Does Clippy just want to help? Just wanting to help may as well be the corporate slogan of every company to ever exist. In the 1998 antitrust law case between the United States and Microsoft, in which Microsoft was accused of the illegal monopolization of the web browser market, Bill Gates claimed that their strategies were not anti-competitive, but rather a dedication to give consumers the innovations that consumers want. For Microsoft, Clippy's anthropomorphism as an innocent failure guy is a piece of the symbolism of a spirit of that desire to just help being the foundational basis of the company's core values. A team of quirky, lovable nerds at heart, where collecting user data arises naturally from just wanting to help build better products and for customers to discover those products more efficiently. Under a microscope, wanting to help does not mean anything. Clippy is not a person, and neither is Microsoft. Horvitz and Nass, Fries and Gates each had their own motivations and ideas, but Microsoft has had 30 years to refine a unified narrative, and it was in this environment that a Microsoft ad was made the face and message of a populist consumer rights movement, where the alternative to Microsoft is still Microsoft. It should be noted, however, that no single entity can necessarily decide the entire meaning of a symbol. Who or what Clippy is cannot be confined to the stories of Microsoft or some YouTubers. Clippy embodies both, but both stories read from the same book. For a historical perspective, though, we can look to the science of the assistance concept. CASA has become a debated paradigm amongst researchers in the new generation. Computers and people are no longer the computers and people of the 90s, and so there are still experiments to be run and research to be done. But what remains from the findings is the phenomenon that even with a complete technical understanding understanding and belief that something is inhuman and inanimate. Our brains are wired, or can be wired, to behave socially upon the mere trigger of social cues. Conjecturally, if an interface had the capability to invoke social behaviors much deeper than politeness, such as empathy, shame, panic, guilt, ostracization, intimacy, then the reliance on such an interface is no longer just a matter of its usage, but rather a deep allocation of trust in those who control such an interface in regards to our social instincts. Awareness of one's own humanity thus becomes key to the navigation of such a reality. The strange and interesting technologies of the past are always fun to study and reminisce on, but the end of the past is the present. Microsoft Office Assistant is part of the story of Microsoft Windows 11, and computers are not gorillas.
Guru Mawa Ate Watashi Kara Henare